Welcome to week 8 of our study of Old Testament survey. This week we're going to be focusing our attention on the prophecy of Daniel. Daniel is in some ways one of the better known books of the Old Testament, and in some ways one of the least known and studied books of the Old Testament. We will discuss that concept as we move along in our discussion this week. The book of Daniel has certainly attracted more interest than any other book of the Old Testament in some ways. If you think back to your days in children's Sunday school classes, you'll remember that some of the stories that we have in the book of Daniel are very, very familiar. They are stories that, stories that we see are so miraculous and so fantastic and so popular among children. Children love to hear the story of Daniel in the den of lions, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And so those are well-known stories from the book of Daniel. And yet the overall message of the book of Daniel seems to be overlooked quite a bit and quite often. When we consider the faithfulness of these men, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the trying circumstances that they faced, then it certainly is a tremendous source of encouragement to believers throughout the ages, Old Testament age as well as the New Testament era. And then on the other hand, the prophetic portions of Daniel seem to be generally ignored. At least in the educational program of the church, we very seldom hear stories of the prophetic message that Daniel gives. And certainly the prophetic message of the prophecy of Daniel far outweighs the stories of Daniel in the den of lions and the three Hebrews in the fiery furnace, even though those are amazing stories and should be studied. And yet, too often they overshadow the more important prophetic portions of the prophecy of Daniel. We don't know very much about Daniel himself, but there are some things that we can learn about Daniel, and one of them from the book itself is that Daniel was a man of extremely high character standards as well as extremely strong convictions. The few things that the Bible does reveal to us about Daniel include the following. Chapter 1, verse 3 of his prophecy reveals to us that Daniel was born into the royal family. We also learn that as a young boy, he was carried away to Babylon, and it was there that he was selected to receive special training. He was one of those who really stood out as a young man of great potential, and so he received special training in the what we can call the Royal Academy of Nebuchadnezzar. We also learned that Daniel served as a high official under 3 different kings: Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius. Daniel gained a tremendous reputation for his ability to interpret prophetic dreams. And this is one of the reasons that Daniel was elevated so highly among the Babylonian court of royalty. Daniel received a series of revelations from God, and these revelations are absolutely astounding when we consider the message, because these messages outline God's dealings with his people from the 6th century BC all the way to the end of the Old Testament era. Not just the end of the Old Testament writings, which ended somewhere around 400 BC with Malachi, but far beyond that, all the way up, at least midway through the intertestamental period of time. Daniel was accused of disloyalty by fellow officials in Babylon, and that was because, for the most part, they were so jealous of him. He had been elevated much higher than most of them, and so out of envy and jealousy and strife, they concocted this plan to have Daniel condemned to death. And so Daniel, even though he was well known, well liked, and a man of great character and fidelity, he was still turned over to be killed because of the jealousy and the envy of others who were leaders within the Babylonian ranks of hierarchy. God miraculously delivered Daniel from the den of lions, and this resulted in the conversion of the king, Darius the Mede. What an amazing testimony of the power of God, that the power of God elevated this man, first of all, to be a high official in the court of the king of Babylon, but then as the kingdom was moved to the Medo-Persian kingdom, Daniel was still elevated, highly liked, highly ranked, and highly hated by those who opposed him and refused to believe in Daniel's God. When we consider the chronological notes in the book, it would suggest that Daniel's prophetic career lasted roughly 70 years. A long, long time for Daniel to be involved in this ministry of presenting the message of God to pagan kings. There are 3 times that Ezekiel actually alluded to Daniel, and that's pretty amazing considering the fact that the careers of these 2 prophets, Daniel and Ezekiel, actually parallel each other. But Daniel was so well known that Ezekiel actually mentioned him 3 different times in the book of Ezekiel. If you'll remember, Ezekiel was taken to Babylon about 8 years after Daniel. Ezekiel began to preach 5 years later, 11 years after Daniel's elevation in the court. So he certainly would have known of Daniel and perhaps even knew him personally. We don't know that to be a fact, but the indications would indicate very clearly that these men, if they did not know each other, they knew much about each other. Those references show that Daniel was indeed regarded as a righteous man, a very wise man by the constituency of the population of Babylon, but especially among the fellow exiles in Babylon. Now, we all know the story about Daniel in the lion's den. Well, let's think for a few minutes about Daniel in the critic's den, because there's so much criticism raised against the prophetic messages contained in the book of Daniel. If Daniel spent one night in that den of lions, well, his writing, his book has spent decades and even centuries in a den of critics. And again, maybe, perhaps, no other book in all of the Bible is seen to be such a clear line of delineation between conservative and liberal views of divine revelation. The book of Daniel purports to have been written in the 6th century before Christ. The claim of the book itself is that it's the fruit of the ministry of this man named Daniel, who held high positions of authority in the courts of the kings who ruled Mesopotamia. There's a whole host of people who just simply have a different view of the book. They regard the book of Daniel as pseudepigrapha. That's a word that literally means false writing. They regard it as a book of pseudepigrapha coming from an unknown author and as late as the 2nd century BC. Now that's 400 years after the book itself claims to have been written. The book was supposedly written to give encouragement to faithful Jews while they were going through their conflict with Antiochus Epiphanes. And that, of course, is between the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. So again, liberal scholarship assigns the book to a very, very late date of writing. Just a couple of ideas that have come out of liberal scholarship. In 1899, J.D. Prince wrote this very interesting statement. It is now the general opinion of most scholars who study the Old Testament from a critical point of view that this work cannot possibly have originated, according to the traditional theory, at any time during the latter Babylonian monarchy when the events recorded are supposed to have taken place. Interesting statement, to say the least. First of all, note the statement, this work cannot possibly have originated according to the traditional theory. When the events recorded are supposed to have taken place. Such a liberal slant, such a statement, a pretty adamant statement about the fact that we cannot accept the fact that the prophecy of Daniel was actually written so early in the 6th century BC, simply because of the contents of the book. Another statement from R.H. Charles in 1929. As a result of modern research, it is now generally agreed amongst scholars that the book of Daniel was written about or shortly before 165 BC. 165 BC. The reason that date is significant is because that date is after all of the chronological information that Daniel is prophetically providing through the divine revelation of God. And since liberal scholarship cannot believe and embrace the idea that God can indeed inspire his writers to give predictive prophecy, then they have to discount any regard to the date that is alluded to in the book itself. So, the question is, why do the critics continue to deny the 6th century date for Daniel? Well, it's pretty obvious, but let's look at that for just a few minutes. First of all, they say it's because the book contains prophecies of post-Babylonian events which supposedly become increasingly accurate as they approach the date 165 BC. Interesting? Yes. Conclusive? Certainly not. But let's consider another. Stated in its simplest forms, the real issue here is whether the God of Scripture, the God of the universe, the God who is omniscient, who knows everything that has ever happened, is happening, and will happen, whether or not that God can predict the near and distant future with pinpoint accuracy. That's really where the rub comes. And this is really the details that have to be discussed and understood in light of biblical prophecy. Let's consider for a moment some of the characteristics of Daniel. Daniel is a bilingual book. What I mean by that is the book of Daniel is written in 2 languages, actually, Hebrew and Aramaic. The book itself begins and concludes in Hebrew, chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4, and then concluding with chapter 8, verse 1 through the end of the book. All of that is written in Hebrew. The middle portion is in Aramaic. Aramaic was the international language of the 6th century. So it appears that the Aramaic was used in those portions of the book which deal with the future of the Gentile empires, while Hebrew was used where the text has direct bearing on the Israelites. Now that doesn't argue for 2 different authors, one writing the Hebrew portions and one writing the Aramaic portions. It doesn't allude to that at all. It's just simply that those portions that were written in Hebrew were specifically for the people of Israel, whereas those portions written in Aramaic were specifically directed at the Gentile nations. We can also note that the book of Daniel is a unified book. Now, there are some liberals that argue for multiple authorship of the book of Daniel, and they say that various chapters are assigned to different centuries. Some assign the different language sections to different authors, while others assign the material to various authors on the basis of content. And yet there is absolutely no reason to discount the fact that the book was indeed written by one man, as it purports to have been, and this man arranged his material to serve his purpose in writing the material that he records. The book is also an apocalyptic book. Daniel is receiving revelations concerning the future, and he receives these actually in dreams and visions, and then he gives those. And all of the symbolism that he gives in this apocalyptic literature is symbolic to some degree, and yet it bears testimony to a very accurate historical panoramic view of what's going to take place from his lifetime all the way through, especially the end of the New Testament era, but again, some portions that take us all the way beyond our present day and time. So this literature is called apocalyptic literature by biblical scholars. We've also already made note of the fact that the book is indeed a miraculous book. The book of Daniel records a cluster of miracles which God performed during the period of the exile. And again, this is the reason that liberal scholarship doesn't accept the authenticity of the book and comes up with all of these arguments about multiple authors and multiple times and all of that. And it's because the book contains so much of the miraculous, not only in predictive prophecy, but in miracles that were actually performed by God during Daniel's stay in Babylon. Let's turn our attention now to the purpose of the book of Daniel. First of all, the author had a polemic purpose. He is presenting factual details that is going to raise the attention of the people to whom he writes about the purposes and the plans of God. He intended to place the omnipotence of God in sharp contrast to the impotence of all the false deities that were worshipped by the Babylonians. So it's polemic, it's argumentative in the sense that it's presenting opposing views. The book also has a didactic purpose, a purpose of teaching. It teaches the absolute, invaluable truth that God frustrates the designs of the most powerful monarchs, but at the same time, he defends the servants who remain faithful to him and his purposes and plans. Third, it seems rather clear that the author intended his book to be a source of consolation for the people of his own day, as well as people of future generations. Believers throughout the centuries have taken great comfort in Daniel's revelation. It teaches us that God has determined historical events that would lead to his climactic purpose in bringing everything to a conclusion. And in God's own time, the trials of all saints of all ages will end. So it's a book of great consolation to those who would read and abide by his teaching. Fourth, of course, as we have already stipulated, the book is predictive. Holy Spirit, through Daniel, gives an outline of the course of world history as it relates specifically to the people of God. Now let's give our attention for a few minutes to the chronology of Daniel. 10 of the 12 chapters in the prophecy of Daniel are actually dated according to the years of the reigning Gentile ruler. The remaining 2 chapters, chapters 3 and 4, are actually assigned dates in the Septuagint version, but not in the Hebrew text. Chronologically, the book of Daniel can be divided according to these schemes. The reign of Nebuchadnezzar. This is from 605 to 562 BC, and these 4 chapters, chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, are chapters that are relative to that particular time frame. Chapter 1 has to do with Daniel being raised to power in 604 BC. In chapter 2, we have the story of the image dream. That took place in 602 BC. Chapter 3 is the fiery furnace episode with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and that is somewhere around 600 BC. You see I have a question mark there. 600 BC is a really good guesstimate, but again, there is some wiggle room there, as it is on chapter 4, the tree dream, 570 BC or thereabouts. Then we have the reign of Nabonidus or Belshazzar, 556 to 539 BC. Chapter 7 is the vision of the 4 beasts. Chapter 8 is the vision of the ram and goat. And chapter 5 is the vision of the handwriting on the wall. And then finally, we have the reign of Cyrus and Darius in 539 to 530 BC. Chapter 9 is the vision of 70 sevens. Chapter 6 is the lion's den. And chapters 10 through 12, the final vision. And again, we don't really have time to go into detail, but to those, that vision in chapter 9 of the 77s is certainly an amazing prophecy relative not only to the future of Daniel, but also to the future from our present day perspective as well. Because most conservative scholarship believes that that is a prophecy relative to the tribulation and the events that are going to transpire during that historical time frame. So again, a truly amazing testimony to predictive prophecy that we have in the book of Daniel. Next week, we're going to give our attention to the minor prophets, actually for weeks 9 and 10. Now, we're going to have to cover a lot because there are 12 minor prophets. We have purposely spent more time on the major prophets because simply of the fact that they are identified in such a way, and because the material that is contained in the major prophets is more extensive. But over the next 2 weeks, we will do an overview of all 12 of the minor prophets. So look forward to that, and I'll look forward to being back with you next week for another chapter in our study of Old Testament. God bless you. Have a great week.